Greetings, friends. My name is Helene Altavote. As the Vice President of the Friends of Old Dover, recently renamed the Historical Society of Dover, the Delaware Division of Cultural Affairs, and the Old State House, we welcome you to today's presentation. Our society's primary goal is to encourage the preservation of buildings and properties of historic value and importance in Dover and Kent County, Delaware. In addition, we hope to educate the public through programs and special events to raise awareness of Dover's rich historical heritage. Today, we have the pleasure to share a bit of history about a local hero of the Revolutionary War, Allen McLane. Captain McLane, portrayed by Tom Welch, will speak about his close relationship with George Washington, which remained a strong relationship for more than 20 years. Tom Welch has worked as a historical interpreter since 2007. Prior to that, he spent 27 years as a celebrated administrator at Wesley College in Dover. The program you're about to witness was filmed in the Old State House on the Green. There will be a question and answer period after hearing from Captain McLane, and during the program with the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen. And now for our feature presentation, Allen McLane.
I would like to share one sentence from the Washington Bicentennial Booklet published by the Delaware Public Archives Commission in February 1932 in celebration of the 200th birthday of George Washington. There were 4 pages on Allen McLane covering his relationship with General and President George Washington. Allen McLane was a man in such close contact with George Washington and was so trusted by the general, a fact readily ascertained from a cursory study of McLane's military career, that it has been deemed proper in the bicentennial year to bring to the attention of Delawareans General Washington's military relationship with this son of Delaware, and to show how McLane fulfilled the trust placed in him. Today, Allen McLane reminisces on the 25 years that he knew the great man, George Washington, for 8 years during the Revolutionary War and in his federal government appointments as the first Marshal of the Delaware District and as tax collector of the Port of Wilmington. Today's setting is in the Senate chamber of the State House, where McLane has been invited to help in a celebration of the birthday of George Washington. The date is February 20th. The year is 1829.
I'm so pleased that you've invited me to be here to help honor George Washington, a great man, and I'll get to that in just a minute, but I also have to tell you how pleased I am that it's in this building. It was in this very building, in the chamber right next door, where I started my career in this building. After serving about 14, 15 years in the tavern right over here on the corner, in October of 1791, the General Assembly moved to this building, and the Senate to this very chamber, and the House of Assembly to the other chamber. I was elected Speaker of the House, and though we only had 8 days, we did have a fairly productive session. We moved the county seat of Sussex County from Lewistown over to the middle of the county, bought a farm, and started the new county seat there. You call it Georgetown. But more importantly, we set in motion a second constitutional convention, which did several things. Some fairly inconsequential, some name changes. For example, the House of Assembly became the House of Representatives, and what had been the Legislative Council, the William Penn name from 150 years earlier, became the Senate. But most importantly, that Constitution extended the vote to a much higher percent of the population. Delaware was one of the first states to drop the requirement that you had to be a major landholder before you could vote. A great step forward in expanding democracy for the common folks, and I think we all have reason to be proud of that very fact. But that's all reminiscing. I need to add one more thing. It was in this very chamber just a few weeks ago that my son got elected to the U.S. Senate. The spot made available when Senator Clayton left, and so under the laws, the Senate elected my son Lewis to be the U.S. Senator. And on that note, he and I are headed to Washington. About as soon as I can get back to Wilmington, we're going to pack up and head to Washington, where we can participate in the inauguration of brand new President Andrew Jackson. Son Lewis became fairly close to Jackson in his campaign. You might say he was the campaign manager for Jackson here in the state. And even though he's going to go into the Senate, there's some talk of an appointment from President Jackson for Lewis, and we'll find out about that later. But anyway, the reason we're here is to talk about this great man. He was truly, truly a great man. And there are many people who would speak better about him. I have no doubt that Alexander Hamilton, who was so close to him, both as an adjutant and then as his Secretary of the Treasury, could speak very eloquently about our general and president. Also, some of his generals, particularly Nathaniel Greene and Henry Knox, who he also had a great relationship with. Unfortunately, they're all dead now. There are 6 Delawareans who were in a position to speak very well of him. Caesar Rodney, Richard Bassett, Gunny Bedford Jr., Thomas McLane, George Reed, and John Hazard. All of them could speak well of him. But they too are gone. So it appears that you're stuck with me. There's one man who could speak very well of him, and that would be the Marquis de Lafayette. But he happens to be in France. He was here 4 years ago when he had an extended visit. I think he was able to get to all 30 states when he was here. But that was in 24, 25. So anyway, you are stuck with me. My time with General Washington began when he invited especially military people from Delaware, Maryland, and New Jersey, and I think Pennsylvania, yeah, definitely Pennsylvania, to come up to New Jersey, to Amboy, to be part of the camp there that was going to be called the Flying Camp. The Flying Camp was to be ready reserve to go where needed, when needed. So our local Delaware regiment hiked first to Philadelphia, stayed there a very short time, and then on up to Amboy, and then very quickly, General Washington said, the British are coming. They had left Halifax, and with, I don't know how many ships, but enough ships to bring 30,000 British and Hessian troops, and they were going to take New York. And General Washington knew he needed help. So I was not in the Continental Army at that time. I was a lieutenant and an adjutant to Caesar Rodney and his company. But they had left in August, and I very quickly went up by myself as a volunteer. I had letters of free passage, safe passage from both Caesar Rodney and Thomas McLane in my knapsack, and I went on up. Shortly after getting up there, I wanted to make contact with some unit that I could fight with, and I couldn't find the Delaware men right away, the Delaware Blues. So I linked up with a Pennsylvania rifle company under a Colonel Samuel Attlee, and they were in heavy fighting with the British when I arrived. Colonel Attlee had just lost one of his primary assistants, and I offered my services, and he pressed me into duty, and I was able to help by running air errands and leading them through the swamp. Apparently, short time there, I got the feel of the swamp, and I led them through Gowanus Swamp, was the only way they could get back to the American lines. Unfortunately, we lost some of our young boys. And we did come in contact with the Delaware Blues, so we were now together. I was with them, even though not officially. So we were able to capture 20 or more Hessian troops. And we didn't capture many of the enemy that day, but that was one of the ones that did draw attention to us and our capable soldiery that we did. I have suspicion that that got to General Washington, and I think that Colonel Attlee may have told him that I performed well on the battlefield, and because of things that happened later. And we'll talk, just, if I don't come up with it, remind me of the Battle of Princeton. So soon thereafter, well, I think it might have been the third day of the battle. The British, in their far superior weapons, training, numbers, had pushed all of our men to the north shore of Long Island. We feared the worst. We feared that the British, we knew they had ships, and we anticipated that when the fog lifted, those ships would come in and cannonade all of us in a very great jeopardy on that North Shore. Well, this is where the forethought and the planning of our commander, unbeknownst to us, he had arranged with Colonel John Glover of the Marblehead Fishermen to round up all the boats he could and had his Marblehead, I think it was a regiment, had his Marblehead fishermen and some other men, I think from Rhode Island, to overnight transport all of the thousands of our troops safely across to Manhattan. We were not all across when the sun began to come up, so we thought, well, many men had made it, but many of the rest of us, and General Washington had put the Delaware Regiment and some Maryland soldiers under a General Guest and General Smallwood. And he'd left us, and I was with them in that assignment, he left us in rear guard. Now, number one, it's quite an honor when the commander leaves a unit in rear guard. But it's also major risk. That meant we would be the last ones to cross. Well, it was looking bleak, and people began to say, have you written your will? Can you stand a British prison? And we saw the word, the British ships are coming in, man. And we felt really distraught. Well, General Washington many times is reputed to have believed in divine providence. And I can't say that I do, but in the face of evidence, I have to say that the subject is not yet determined. One of the biggest, worst fogs, you really might say one of the best fogs that ever hit that area, came in, preventing the ships from being able to see us, and actually they would have been in danger if they came in not being able to see where they're going. They could have been grounded. So we all made it across, all of us. There were 2 or 3 laggards who were trying to find something of value that they could take. They were rummaging, and they got caught, but that's their fault. So this is a signal honor for our commander. Though we got defeated in the battle, he did what he became famous for, holding his army together so that we could fight another day. And fight another day we did. The New York campaign went very badly. We lost at Kips Bay. We lost at Harlem Heights. We lost at, I'm told I say this incorrectly by people from New York, Mamaroneck or Mamaroneck or whatever it is, and also White Plains. Pretty much losing every battle. Then General Washington decided this is not going to be a winning situation. So he determined we needed to head to Pennsylvania. Well, before he could get there, we also lost the two major forts we had on the Hudson River, Fort Washington on the east side, Fort Lee on the west side, and one of his favorite generals, Nathaniel Greene, was in charge there, and he suggested to Nathaniel that he vacate, I think it's Fort Lee, I believe it was Fort Lee, that Fort Lee was the one he was in charge of, and he didn't. He said, we can defend it, we have enough men. Well, they couldn't defend it, so several thousand of our men, including Nathaniel Greene, were captured. Luckily for him, we captured some high-ranking British officer, and General Washington was able to exchange to get him back. But nonetheless, the New York campaign was a major loss. So the next objective was to head to the safety of Pennsylvania. So as we trekked down and fought our way, because the British, led by that one of the best generals, one of the most aggressive generals the British had, Lord Cornwallis, on our heels pretty much every inch of the way. Well, when we got to the Trenton and needing to cross the Delaware River, yet again, General Washington did what was needed. He had his faithful Colonel Glover to grab all the boats that we can on the east side, so helped us get across, and we barely made it. We barely made it across, but leaving no boats for the British to follow us. So here we were in Pennsylvania, the safety of Pennsylvania, but our situation was extremely bleak. Things were very dark. Morale was low. Most of the men who had come up from the flying camp had enlistments that ended on December the 31st. Other men were deserting. There were almost no supplies. There weren't enough blankets, there weren't enough boots, there weren't enough tents, there weren't enough coats, there wasn't enough food, there wasn't enough ammunition. We lost most of our battles. No wonder Congress, so we heard, Congress was beginning to negotiate with the British to end it. I think you call that surrender. The newspapers were scathing the Congress and the commander and our whole cause, saying it was very bleak, which it absolutely was. So what is going to be the salvation of this most bleak situation? Who else? General Washington, with his back to the wall, had to come up with an answer. And the answer was, we've got to have a victory. And he determined the best way to have a victory is the closest thing there was to where we were was across the river, Trenton. Trenton was one of about a dozen or so outposts that the British has established and staffed them mostly with Hessians. So there were maybe 1,500 Hessians at Trenton. And because we'd done so badly, they got very lax, thinking, number one, it's winter, fighting is over, and they're not very good at fighting anyway, so we don't need to worry about these Americans. So they didn't even really put up good defenses of Trenton. And General Washington got intelligence information from some farmer who came over and told him how it was. So he determined, had to keep it secret, only his close staff, the general that I mentioned earlier, Henry Knox, was his, I guess you might say, his primary military advisor, and became his head of artillery. And they planned, and kept it very quiet from all of us. We didn't know what was coming up. He planned an overnight surprise raid on Trenton. And we had something in the neighborhood of 2,000 troops. He divided into 3 units. A southern unit of about 700 or 800, a central unit of about the same number, and the northern unit, which he actually led. The weather was terrible. was almost gale force winds. There were something like icebergs in the river. It had been raining a lot, so the current was heavy. But he had rounded up something called Durham boats. And they were ones that had been used for iron mining or whatever. They were big enough to have horses and cannon on. But they weren't just small rowboats. These were good-sized boats, about 60 feet long. And we made it across. The Delaware Regiment and I were with him at that northern unit. We got across later than he thought. His whole idea was to get there and attack Trenton before sunup. Well, everything was slow. And our good friend John Hassett even fell off the boat in the icy water and was suffering very heavily. He still was a fighting man. He still did his part until we all know a week later. So we made it across 8 miles from Trenton. So we had to make that hike down. We didn't know at the time that neither of the other two units decided they could make it. They both turned back because the circumstances were so high. But not our leader. He said we have no choice. General Knox and other officers were saying, General Washington, this is hopeless. We can't possibly do it. And he said, we have no choice. We must follow through on this. Liberty or death. That was the code name. Liberty or death. And we took it seriously. We thought, if we don't win this and gain and make a step toward gaining our liberty, we will all die. So, without getting into all the particulars, we won that battle. And a day or so later, we went back across to Pennsylvania with a little bit of smugness on our part that we had defeated the enemy, at least in one small, and I'm sure some people might have thought inconsequential battle. General Washington mulled it over a couple of days. He said, man, we can't quit. We've got to go on. We've got to take advantage of what we've got working for us. So we, probably 29th of December, 4 days after the first trip across, we went across again with the goal, which we didn't know at first, but we found out it was Princeton. But when we got across the river, we discovered that that old nemesis, General Cornwallis, was coming down from Princeton. He had, actually, we found out later, he'd been in New York waiting for passage to go back to England to take care of his ailing wife. But when General Clinton, I think General Howe was commanded it, when General Howe discovered that they had lost at the Battle of Trenton, he sent an urgent message, Cornwallis, you can't go now. You've got to come back and lead our troops. So he'd come down to Princeton and he was probably fit to be tied that he had to give up that trip back. And he wanted to defeat Washington. He wanted to push his face in the mud, and he wanted to do it completely and settle it and end the war if possible. Well, so there was a brief skirmish on that first afternoon, and it was late starting, so it didn't progress much. I don't know how people could claim a victory other than we were still standing at the end of the day, but some people say we won a second Trenton, and so we were situated apart by not many yards. We could see their campfires over on the other side. And we got notice, middle of the night, might have been 2 o'clock. Change of plans, gentlemen. We're not going to meet Cornwallis tomorrow. We're going to Princeton. So General Washington led us all up to Princeton, won a decisive, nice victory there, and gathered lots of supplies and tents and blankets and things that we needed. So not only did General Washington, again, keep the army together, he had a string of what you might call 3 victories. And those victories led to many positive circumstances, which turned around the perception of our plight as being hopeless. the enlistments picked up. Some men who were planning to head home said, no, I can stay. This deserves my attention. So General Washington, rather than go at, there was some talk, some of his generals said, hey, General, we got it going. Let's move on up. Let's go to Brunswick. Let's go to Amboy. Let's knock off some of these other outposts. And I think General Washington, as I look back on it, made the wise decision. We're on positive footing now. We've done enough to change the negative morale that's been going over the nation. So those three victories, plus a later victory some months later at Saratoga, were enough to get the American delegation in France, led by Dr. Franklin, to get the French to sign a treaty of war, declaring war against the British, and come to our aid with troops and ships and money, and to provide all the things that we needed. Now, I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail about this early phase of the war for 2 or 3 reasons. One of which it relates to my part of knowing General Washington. At the Battle of Princeton, right after our good friend John Haslett took a bullet to the head and died right there on the spot. Shortly thereafter, General Washington came to me and said, Lieutenant McLane, you're now Captain McLane, and I'm commissioning you to go back to Delaware and recruit your own company. And when you come back north to join us, I have a very special job for you. And the job was in a letter that I got, not signed by the commander, but I know it was the commander's thought, signed by a man who became, for sure became a general, James McHenry. James McHenry sent me the letter that said, the commander wants you to be his eyes and ears. And he gave me, and I thought I brought it with me, I don't think I did, but it's a list of 27 specific things to be on the lookout for. What about shipping? What about wagons being loaded? What are the patriots who are in the city of Philadelphia think? What are the loyalists in Philadelphia think? How's the food holding up, etc. 27 specific things. And I'd summarize them by saying he wanted me to watch the enemy, learn what I could in many ways as I could, and keep him apprised of strength, the location, and the intentions of the enemy. And this I was able to do. And for 5 years, I was able to do intelligence work on his behalf. And especially in those early days in Philadelphia, because that was the place of my nativity, and I spent my first 20 years there. So when the Army was at Valley Forge, I was stationed usually about halfway between Valley Forge and Philadelphia with my 94 or 100 men, and we were called the Allen McLane Partisan Party, and we supposedly, it's been said, we wreaked havoc on the British. We intercepted their food supplies, so much so that the British called us the market stoppers. We stopped their supply of food going into the city. They were and they knew who I was by name. They were so unhappy with what we were doing to them and to their cause that they put a 1,000-pound price on my head. And I'm proud to say they never did collect that. Well, moving on. I'd like to summarize what I think about General Washington with a few thoughts. First is, he was just a very, very good man. A man who prized high moral standards and ethical conduct, and you almost say all the best virtues. And it's supposedly, he picked this up as a child. He came across a book, and I don't have the exact title, but it's something like this: 110 Rules of Ethical Behavior and Good Conduct. And he held that book still had it, you know, as an adult. And he wrote down all those 110 rules and memorized them and kept them to his heart. But nonetheless, he was a mightily good man. In addition, he was a good judge of character. And I can't say to accept judgment and know whether this would be a good man, a good officer or not, but he had a good record of being able to pick people. And one thing that he did that was not true of the British Army, in order to be an officer, general, colonel, whatever, you had to be a wealthy person who often even bought their commission. Not so here. Nathaniel Greene was a store owner, one of his major generals. Henry Knox was a bookstore owner. Alexander Hamilton, his critics would say, he's a bastard from the Caribbean. So you take those, some of the key people on his staff, but he saw the talent, he saw the initiative, he saw the drive that they had, and they were some of his best men throughout the war. And there's a whole bunch, I just gave you 3 examples. He also could motivate people. And it's not that he was a great orator, but the sincerity, going back to that first thing that I talked about, people saw his goodness and his sincerity, and that he was able to lead and reach men. He also was able to seek opinions and staff officers who were maybe smarter than him, more educated than him, or more military experience than he had, but he was confident enough in his own person that he could deal with that. When you think about it, on his cabinet, he had his Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, and his Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, and they could barely abide each other. And they were 2 of the key people on his cabinet. You throw in Vice President John Adams, and there was enough venom among those 3 men to go around. So he was able to lead and guide and select people. The last thing I want to say is how good he was in his appreciation for the common man. I have more to tell, but I want to close with this. There's a young man by the name of Joseph Plum Martin. I bumped into him several times. He was in the Army for all 8 years. Came in when he was 15, and he wrote a book about all his experiences. One of the best books by anybody during the entire war. And he tells one story toward the end of the war. It was 1781, and he was a sapper. Now, if you don't know what a sapper is was a digger. They were digging the trenches to get closer and closer and closer so the cannon could be moved closer at Yorktown. And one night, the sappers were taking a break and grabbing a bite to eat, and this gentleman came along, a military officer, and it was dark, and they couldn't see anything other than he had a white pants on. And he was very congenial and very conversant with them, and they were a little surprised, not something that happened all the time, and they were enjoying a snack with him and having a light conversation with him, and they had no idea who it was until somebody said, "Your Excellency, we need to get back to camp." And all of a sudden, they realized they had just spent time with their commander. It's my view that without this man at the helm, as Commander-in-Chief in the Revolutionary War, as President of the Constitutional Convention, and then for 2 terms as our very first President, without him in all of these roles, I'm not sure that the United States of America would have been possible. I don't know what else I could say about this man. I am so honored to have known him as I did. And I thank you for your attention. As I told you, I'm headed north to Wilmington, where my son and I are going to head over and partake of the inauguration of our brand new president. I started to say General Jackson. Well, he too was a general. General Jackson, now President Jackson. Thank you very much.
The speaking engagement in the State House in 1829 is fictional, but all the events and people mentioned are actual history, derived from research of the papers of George Washington, the Journal of Alan McLane, and other documents. Alan McLane and son Lewis actually did go to Washington to see the inauguration of Andrew Jackson. After serving 2 years of the U.S. Senate term, Lewis then served in the Jackson cabinet as both the Secretary of the Treasury and Secretary of State. 3 months later, on May 29, 1829, Alan McLane passed away in Wilmington and went to his eternal rest beside his beloved Rebecca in the Asbury Methodist Cemetery. He had served his nation and his state well for over 50 years in the military and in state and federal positions. His wife Rebecca experienced a great deal of sadness due to the fact that of their 14 children, only 3 survived past infancy. Their children and grandchildren followed Alan's example. Only 3 survived, Alan's example to become servants of the nation in a variety of fields, including the military, government, and industry. Their fields of responsibility included U.S. Senator, Governor of Maryland, and diplomatic posts to several countries. They also held top positions in railroads, banking, shipping, and mining. Truly an extraordinary family legacy. George Washington, until this day, is considered by many historians and the general population as our most important president. This is in spite of the fact that his legacy is tarnished, since he was a slave owner and is criticized for his military record against Native Americans. When many of us were in school, we celebrated the birthdays of both George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. But in 1972, with the creation of President's Day, the recognition of Washington's birthday has been lost. So we all need to make special effort to remember and celebrate the father of our country. His role as military leader, President of the Constitutional Convention, and his 2 terms as our first president made possible the United States of America.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Old State House. My name is Gavin Malone, and I'm with the Delaware Division of Historical and Cultural Affairs in Delaware. We'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us today. I will be fielding the questions for Colonel McLane, portrayed by Tom Welch, and we will be answering as many of the questions as we can. I currently need to remind everyone that we would like you to put any questions in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. So we'll begin with the first question, which is, so Colonel McLane, you knew Benedict Arnold. Can you talk a little bit about what you know about him?
Well, can I start out by saying
I first met him when I recruited my company of 94 men down here. One Andrew Finney, after being recruited, took off and acted like he had not been recruited. Well, I went after him and brought him back in to be brought on charges, and we went before a colonel who heard the case and determined that he was not guilty, but he fined me 10 pounds for abusing my authority. And that colonel was Benedict Arnold. Second time I ran across him is after he had been so badly injured in the Battle of Saratoga that General Washington had to pull him off as a field general for a few months and made him the military commander of Philadelphia. Well, when the British left, there were all kinds of supplies in the basements, and General Washington had said, be sure to get these to our quartermaster so that our troops can have them. Well, here was that General Benedict Arnold again, who set up a black market ring with some local businessmen, and I reported him to General Washington. Well, General Washington did not want to believe it. He had such faith in Benedict Arnold. Actually, I was punished. My independent command, which I had enjoyed, which I think General Washington had benefited from when I was bringing intelligence reports in from what the British were doing in Philadelphia. My spy ring, about 6 men who were getting us information, let me know that Benedict Arnold was violating anything that we needed. He was selling those supplies, which should have been going to our army. And he was so angry when he heard that I had reported him that he basically wanted my head on a plate. And General Washington took away my command, and for about 1.5 years, until Benedict Arnold was discovered to be a scoundrel, I was in a much less prominent position. I was not able to do as much I was still doing my job, but it was a much reduced level until it was discovered that Benedict Arnold was a traitor. Final thing that I had was when he was down with the British, they gave him a brigadier generalship, and he was down there, and I had one of 3 efforts to kidnap him, and we were all set and we were ready. He was riding his horse on the James River every morning, and we knew that, and unaccompanied, and we had a plan to kidnap him. And lo and behold, the day that was to happen, 2 British ships came in the James River, and that ended that effort. So yes, I did know him, and there was nothing good about that knowing, I have to admit. Do you have any more questions, sir?
Yes, next question is, how big was Washington's army compared to Cornwallis's?
Well, if you're talking about most of the time during the war, we were outmanned, but General Washington had determined probably by the 2nd year in the war that he did not want to ever choose to have a face-to-face battle with the British when they had higher numbers. So he determined that he was only going to initiate battle when he had the advantage of numbers or surprise. And at Yorktown, lost the name there for a second, at Yorktown, we had the advantage of both. And we had, I think, something like 20 plus thousand, and Cornwallis only had 7,000 or 8,000. So that was one time when we overwhelmed them with numbers. He also had the advantage of surprise in that, since he believed that the final battle was not going to be in Virginia, but was going to be in New York, he was overruled, and the French convinced him that it should be in Virginia, because he believed that it was going to be in New York. British spies knew that he wanted New York, so they were doing everything they could to defend New York. General Clinton, who was in New York, even sent a message to General Cornwallis, please send me some troops up here to New York, because we know that's where Washington is going to attack. So that one time, we definitely had an advantage of numbers. Sir, do you have another question?
Yes, our next question is, would you discuss your most dangerous mission?
Well, there'd be several choices in that. I think probably Probably, I would say it would have been when I went into the fort in Stony Point, New York, to gather information, which led to the raid, very successful raid on Stony Point. And so I was in disguise, but it was not much of a disguise. I was there as a New York militiaman escorting a Mrs. Smith who had every right to go in there. And then a few days later, we actually raided the fort, and there were 3 units that went left, middle, and right flanks, and I was in charge of the reserve. So I think the danger there was of that sort. I have to add another one. Right after, just before the British left Philadelphia, they discovered, or they set up a trap. They had one of, it wasn't a spy for us. We thought it was a spy for us. And he said he would meet me at a church, I think outside of Frankfurt, near Philadelphia. And it was after, just as the sun was setting, just as I got there, I had a patrol of 10 or 12 men with me. And I told them to hang back and that I would go up and meet this informant. And just before I got to him, he went running away. And of course, I knew what that meant. And around the building came about 12 mounted British dragoons. And I was still on my horse. So I took off, and they chased me, and they got between me and my men. So my men were totally out of the picture at that point. So I always had a fast horse. So I was getting away from most of the men, but 2 of the British were going to catch me. And I decided I've got to take a stand and do something for these 2. So went over a rise, and I turned and fired at the one man and disabled him. And the other one must have already fired his pistol. So he came on up close to me, and I disarmed him with the butt of my gun. Unfortunately, I grabbed his sword and cut my hand very badly. Well, I didn't have time to stop to take care of my wounds, because the other 10 or 11 men were racing on, and they were trying to collect that 1,000-pound bounty on my head. So I raced ahead until I found a mill pond, jumped in the mill pond, shooed my horse away, and I stayed in the mill pond for several hours until I could determine that they had gone away. And I went in camp the next day, and the Marquis was one who, matter of fact, I kept the note that he gave me congratulating me on my safety. So I guess maybe as far as personal danger, that would be the time. You have another question, sir?
I have a question about General Washington. Someone wants to know, did Washington execute people for desertion?
Yes, he did. I think he hated to do it, but desertion or mutiny or whatever. And I think there was one occasion where there were 6 men that he caught for desertion, and he needed not to eliminate a lot of troops, needed all the troops. So they drew straws, and the 5 men, the 5 soldiers, had to execute their comrade. And I think that was a very effective way. Those men, my guess is they would never mutiny again. They would never desert again. And I think it brought tears to many, including him. He did not want to execute his own men, but he felt that military order and military discipline required that he do so. So give me a chance for a sip of water, and I'll take another question. Yes, sir. Got one? Or
So,
they run out?
Here's an interesting question. What was the press opinion, the newspaper opinion of George Washington during the war? Were they as critical as news sources are today of our leadership?
I think the press was always mixed. And I would say leading up to the Battle of Trenton, Um, Even if the press liked the general, um, they went along with most everybody else who thought he is just out of his element. He just doesn't have what it takes. Um, it turned around a great deal after that 10-day period, Battle of Trenton and the Battle of Princeton, and that was a great time. It also, after the Battle of Stony Point, the press and the Congress and the people had begun again to doubt his success. And the Battle of Stony Point, where he'd sent me in as spy, was also a very important thing because it was a headline. And that's what he wanted, a headline. And he had commissioned General Anthony Wayne to do that, basically saying, I need a headline. I need a positive headline to turn around the attitude of the people, the press, and certainly the Congress. And that both those occasions did turn around the press, but it was always mixed. At times, majority would be for him, and at other times, majority would be a little more tepid in their support of our general.
Our next question comes from Montgomery County, Pennsylvania. He asked, I had discovered the story of Lafayette near captured by the British after leaving Valley Forge for reconnaissance at Daring Hill, Lafayette Hill, and the disaster that would have ensued if he and his precious Continentals had been captured. The brilliant maneuvering and intelligence that prevented this disaster is an incredible story. The question is, why do you think that more stories like this aren't well known?
Sir, whoever asked this question, I don't know, you didn't mention my role in that, but I had a very significant role in it. I think it was the 16th of June. I had led a body of men in to interrupt the retirement party for General Howe in Philadelphia. And the party was called the Mischienza. Now, remember, I said June 17th, May 17th. And we led a group, and we disrupted the retirement party, which had been planned by Captain John Andre. And they chased us out of town. At the same time, that day, 40-something men escaped from Philadelphia prison. So in effect, our raid and disruption of that party occasioned or allowed these prisoners, American prisoners, to escape from that prison. Now, that's all background. The very next day, so we heard General Howe was so angry that we had disrupted his party, plus the fact that he had heard that Commander Washington had just given Lafayette his first command, about 2,100 men. And he was so afraid that young Lafayette, even though a very intelligent military officer, was still, I think he was 19 or 20 years old, that he might do something rash. So he gave him a lengthy letter. Please, I think the message was, please don't get captured, please don't get killed. And so he sent him out and said, do not set up a permanent camp and do not make contact with the enemy. You're there for observation only. It's a long letter. Well, then he leveraged his bet in a sense. He got two people, I think it was Major Dan Morgan and Captain Alan McLane, to be bodyguards. I had a unit of about 100 American troops and 50 Oneida Indians, and he had probably 300 Virginia riflemen. So we were, I was to the south of his encampment at Barron Hill, and Dan was to the north.
Well, my men intercepted the fact that 7,000 troops had come out of Philadelphia to capture Lafayette. And General Clinton or General Howe, they might have both been involved in the battle, but General Clinton was, no, I think it was Howe. General Howe was so confident that he was going to catch, as he called him, the young French prince, that he sent out invitations to join us Friday night for dinner because we're going to have a guest. The young Lafayette's going to be our guest. Well, my men intercepted that, raced in to give Lafayette fair warning, and then there was a skirmish battle. But in the meantime, he knew that 2 miles north of the Barron Hill camp, there was a crossing at I think it's Matin Ford or something like that. So at 100 at a time, he sent his men up to cross, and they did in fact cross. And that was quite a stick in the eye for General Howe, because he did not have that special guest for Friday night dinner. And there were congratulations and pats on the back all around. I got lots of accolades, especially from young Lafayette, for what I had done for him. And General Washington, of course, was quite agreeable as well to that. So it was a highlight, and it immediately followed. So that 2-day period was a very, very important period for us. And right after that was when I got chased. It was in the mill pond. So that was a 2 or 3 day period that was very exciting and very, at least interesting to you people out there who are hearing this.
Could you talk about what you think your most important mission was?
It has 2 parts. When in the March of 1781, when General Washington decided that he was very impatient with the fact that the French had come over in 1780 and they'd gone straight to Rhode Island. The British, with their powerful navy, sealed them in. So for over a year, there'd been no particular sizable benefit from the French being there. So General Washington decided there needed to be a meeting. So he established a meeting, which was in Weathersford, Connecticut, right outside of Hartford. He would come over from the Dobbs Ferry area where the American encampment was. He would get General, why am I losing that French general's name? General Rochambeau. General Rochambeau, and they were going to meet outside of Hartford. And they did. They hit it off. They decided final victory. And General Washington, I mentioned earlier, wanted it to be in New York. The French, behind his back, had decided it can't be. It needs to be somewhere else, like Virginia. Well, what they did agree on, wherever that battle was going to be, they would need the 21 ships of the line under Admiral de Grasse, which was down in the West Indies, fighting the British over the extremely lucrative sugarcane industry. So they needed to pick somebody whom they could trust, somebody who knew the lay of the land. And they picked me. I was the courier. I was the messenger who went down. For the last 3 years, I've been captain, been turned down for major several times. General Washington temporarily breveted me major. I took his dispatches and went down. So this is important part number 1. Went down to the West Indies, located Admiral de Grasse in Haiti, delivered the messages, and was able to tell him. I'd been observing the British fleet down in Virginia for several months under General von Steuben. And so I was able to tell him how it would be if he would come to Virginia. At the end of our meeting, he determined, I will go to Virginia. I will go to the Chesapeake. So he sent the French ship, the Concord, up to let both of them know that he was going to the Chesapeake and to meet them there. And as I headed back on the Congress privateer that we bumped into a ship. The ship British ship that had actually sacked Mount Vernon just a few months earlier. So there was another satisfaction, but we defeated them. We all eventually gathered in the Chesapeake, but it was that that French fleet on September 5th or 6th that defeated the British fleet, kept the British fleet from extracting Cornwallis, which was their objective. And that led to the surrender at Yorktown. So clearly, without a doubt, in my mind, that is the most important thing that I had. Within a few days, General Washington had gotten word that a spy in New York had come across a British stolen signal code book, and he needed somebody to go get that. So I was commissioned to go up that. So this period of time in October, actually June, July till October 1781 would have been the high water mark for my military career. And I'm proud to have gained the confidence of General Washington to such an extent that he gave me these important missions.
All right, we just have two final questions. First, in your opinion, what was the most difficult situation that General Washington faced during the war?
I don't think there's any doubt that it was the period of time from September 1776, when we had the, I'll almost say, debacle of losing New York. And then the fact that it took several weeks for that to wear into his thinking. He realized he could not fight them. So that was the fact that he saved the army by getting out of New York and safely getting across New Jersey, then across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. That was absolutely could be the finish of our army and the finish of the American cause if he had not been successful in doing that. Without a doubt, that would be number one.
Okay, the final question is actually about your son, Lewis. We have someone who wants to know, after he served in the U.S. Senate, what did he do after that?
Well, right up until the end of my life, that's where he was. So somebody else would have to answer that question. Now, if you want Tom Welch to answer that question, he has to take the hat off.
Okay.
So this is Tom Welch speaking now, and I can speak because in 1829, which is the date of this program, he was in the U.S. Senate. 2 years later, Andrew Jackson appointed him the ambassador to England. The official name is the ambassador to the Court of St. James, which is they actually call minister to the Court of St. James, which means ambassador. Then after about 2 years there, he was put on the cabinet as the Secretary of the Treasury. He actually fought with the president over getting rid of the National Bank. And so he sort of got fired, but he got fired into the job of Secretary of State. So I don't know if I'd call that a firing, but he got moved over. He did that for a couple of years, had rave reviews all the way through. He had hope of getting on the U.S. Supreme Court, but actually party affiliations is what kept him from it. The Federalist Party was on the decline, and he became a Jacksonian, which was that combination pretty much kept him from getting on the U.S. Supreme Court. He was, unlike Alan and Rebecca, who had 14 children, only 3 of whom survived. He and his wife, Catherine, had 13 children, of whom 12 survived. So he had to leave the federal government just to pay for his family, cover the cost of the family. That's why he left. And he left. First job was as president of the Morris, New Jersey Canal and Banking Company, a very important canal across from New York all the way over to the Delaware River. Very important as far as bringing iron to the New York area and so on. After doing that for several years and doing an excellent job there, he was called upon to be the president of the brand new first railroad, the B&O Railroad. And he did that a number of years and really got them on sound footing. And then President Polk needed him in the 1840s to help assist on the negotiation of the Oregon Territory, which led to Washington, Oregon, maybe Idaho as well. And so he went to England to help negotiate that, which led to us getting our share of that Oregon Territory. And he went with his good friend, who had been his secretary earlier, a man named Washington Irving, who had been his secretary. Irving then became the ambassador to Spain while he was the ambassador to England, and they became good friends and then stayed lifelong friends and visited each other often. Did I answer your question, sir? Or I may have answered 14 other questions answering that one.
I think so. So Tom, do you have any final thoughts before we wrap everything up today?
Well, I am delighted that, as I see here, there were 40-something people signed in on this call. I think there are 2 or 3 other ways that you can view it, one of which, if your friends would like to see it, and somebody else from friends can tell how to access it online afterwards. But I came to my, you might say, depth study of General President Washington because of my interest in McLane. And then that led me to the point that I've just finished, I guess, my 9th book on Washington. And I think, oh, by the way, the Wesley College Library has, and I don't know what's going to happen with this, they have a library which includes several hundred volumes. And I've been inquiring of the college, since they're going to be merging, or whatever you call it, with Delaware State University, what's going to happen to that collection. I wish it would be put where it's more available. It included 5 series, the Colonial series, the Revolutionary series, the Presidential series, the Retirement series, and each one of these, they're volumes about 3 inches thick, and all of these series, they're all of his letters and all of his writings. And there's so many ways that you can study him. And I've just finished I've started a cute little book entitled The Love Affair at Mount Vernon, which is very historical, but it's written by, I can't remember the name of the writer, but it's a very, very nice book. But there's many, many ways you can study him. And I'm delighted that we have these folks today who are honoring his birthday by participating with us in this program. So I thank you for your support, and I've met many of you here in the State House over the years or at the program. This is, I think, the 6th year. I think this is the 6th year that we have done a George Washington program here. And we've had as many as 80 or 100 people attending those, and I recognize some of the names of people who asked the questions. And yes, I will send the lady who asked for a script. I will send you a script that I used in putting the program together. So I thank you, and I'm honored to be a part of this program.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, again, we would like to thank you so much for joining this program today. Again, it was put together by the Friends of Old Dover, as well as staff from the Division of Historical and Cultural Affairs. So I'd like to thank just a few people here. Brad Richardson for filming Tom's program. Elaine Richardson, Elaine Altigott and Donna Josephowski for helping to coordinate everything, and Mr. Daniel Sisson of the Historical and Cultural Affairs Division for being a technical assistant. We'd also like to make sure you know about a couple of upcoming programs. First, the Old State House for March will be proud to present First Women of the First State. We will have Theo Bronskill of the Lenape Elders Council, joined by Old State House Supervisor Nina Todd and Division Curator of Education, Bertie Lee, and they'll be discussing the life of women in Native American culture, and that's on Saturday, March 20th at 2 p.m. Please feel free to check the Old State House Facebook page, or if you'd like, you can email us at oshmuseum, all one word, at delaware.gov. Also, if you have any other questions about today's program, please feel free to email us, and we'll try to get back to you as quickly as possible. The Friends of Old Dover have their next program on March 27th at 10 a.m. And that will be a virtual presentation by Will Parkhurst, who will be discussing the Fulton family and their time at Rose Cottage in downtown Dover. The focus will be primarily on J. Alexander Fulton and his family and activities taken from his diary entries. And for that, you can register at the Eventbrite page. And I'll make sure to post that on the Old State House Facebook page as well. Additionally, the Friends of Old Dover would like to acknowledge they're going to have some virtual lectures on May 1st of 2021. So stay tuned for more information on that. Please check them out at their Facebook page, which is facebook.com/Friends of Old Dover, or at www.friendsofOldDover.org. And also feel free to check out the Division of Historical and Cultural Affairs website, which is history.delaware.gov. Thank you again so much for joining us, and we hope to see you again at future programs.